Now, there are a lot of other applications for GMOs besides plants. They can be used for medical research, like I said, bacteria, people, so on. But I want to focus for most of this presentation on GMOs in crops, because that is where the majority of the debate is happening right now. There's also a lot of innovation happening in that area, but also in other areas. But the debate is mostly about, should we eat GMO foods? Should we label GM things? Should we allow GM crops into our country? And why or why not? Before we get into a little bit more specific information about GMOs, I just wanted to touch on briefly the fact that GMOs are really, really cool innovations, and they have tons of potential to improve human life. And you'll see some of that in the crops that we're going to talk about when I get to the arguments for GMOs. But I would also like to emphasize that we're just looking at a tiny sliver here. This is just the sliver that happens to be a hot topic at the moment. So the reason that some people think that GM is not a good name for these things is because humans have been changing the genetics of other species for thousands and thousands of years. You can see in the slide here that the corn on the left you would never think of eating because it doesn't look like anything edible, right? Versus the corn on the right is what we do eat, assuming you eat corn. And the same holds true for pretty much every other food item that we eat. There are a few berries that are pretty close, but most things, you wouldn't recognize them in their wild form. And the same is true of animals we've domesticated. They look completely different because we've bred them for our purposes. And so we have changed genes forever. For some reason, this new version of changing genes, gene editing, has met with a lot more opposition than traditional breeding. So, nevertheless, I'm going to keep calling them GM or GMOs. If somebody has a better term, we can totally talk about that. I'm happy to hear it. In crops, you have a few common types of GMOs that are talked about and that are on the market today. There are lots of others, but these are the top 3 that are really worth knowing about. The first one is insect-resistant crops. So there's a toxin that a bacteria produces. The bacteria is called Bacillus thuringiensis, and because that's a bit of a mouthful, we've abbreviated that to BT. So BT can produce this toxin that when pests eat it, they die. So you can see in this lovely illustration here, we have our giant caterpillar ready to chow down with his knife and fork on the corn here. And when he does in fact eat the corn that has been given this BT gene, he dies. Obviously, in real life, the caterpillar is not the size of the corn plant, but it has that effect. Another really common kind that came into the market pretty early on is herbicide, or as Europeans say, herbicide-resistant crops. And the idea there is there's no herbicide on the planet that can kill all of the weeds, but not the one thing you want to grow. They're just not there yet. Maybe someday they will be. But in the meantime, the idea is you create corn, soybeans, whatever, that can withstand common herbicides. This is mostly done with glyphosate. The brand name for glyphosate is Roundup. You may have heard of it. But this could theoretically be done with all kinds of other herbicides as well. So then when you do spray a field of Roundup Ready, that is the brand name, corn or soybeans or whatever, what I just described that doesn't really happen does happen, where everything except the corn dies. And the final category we're starting to see more and more of in the market is disease-resistant crops. Because just like plants and animals, just like animals and humans, plants can get sick. There are bacteria, viruses, fungi, these lovely things called oomycetes, which are kind of like fungi, that can all infect plants and cause them to produce less or to die. So one very simple solution, because it's often very difficult to completely get rid of a pathogen, as we know with COVID, is just to make the plants resistant to it. And so then when they're exposed to the pathogen, they no longer die. So these all sound like good things, I think, right? Plants that aren't dying due to diseases, plants that are naturally resistant to pests. But there are a lot of people who argue against GMOs. So I'm going to take those negative arguments first, and then we'll go to the positive. So I think the most serious charge against GMOs is that they harm human health. And we're going to get a little bit more specific than that, but I would like to say right off the bat that there is no real evidence so far that GM plants harm human health. It could certainly be the case in the future that a GM plant is developed that is somehow harmful to human health, but no study that has been done up to this point, and there have been many, independent and funded by various companies or groups, none of them have turned up anything significant. And as a result, you have all of these people you see on the screen, I guess groups, really, that have declared GMOs to be safe for human consumption. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of them. The European Commission, which is in charge of the European Union's sort of scientific findings, reviewed 130 studies, declared it safe for human consumption. GMOs are still technically illegal in the EU. Not technically, but practically illegal. We can talk about that a little bit more later if you want. They are literally illegal in many of the member states. In Italy, where GMOs have never been legal, 13 scientists conducted a review of 1,783 studies on the effects of GMOs on human health and found no harm. So the short answer is there is no evidence that GMOs harm human health. But let's get a little bit more specific. Do GMOs cause cancer? The only study that suggests that they do was done by a guy called Seralini. And for this reason, because he used rats in the study, Seralini's rats is the name that you often find in the literature on this stuff. And the paper that Seralini published was forcibly retracted and then republished in a non-peer-reviewed journal later. One wonders if that was for the shock factor. But I've gone through all of the concerns that scientists lobbed at this paper to see why it was retracted. And these are the top 3 big concerns, I think, that hold up. Firstly, and I think most importantly, there was no proper control. So if you're a scientist and you're designing an experiment and you want to see what is the effect of this thing, you have a group that has that thing, and maybe you have different doses or treatment regimes or whatever, and then you have a group that doesn't have that thing. Seralini didn't do that. What he did was he had one group of rats eating GM corn. He had one group eating GM corn with glyphosate, Roundup, same thing. And you had one group that was not eating GM corn, but their water was being treated with glyphosate, which is not done, by the way. Nobody's drinking glyphosate. And yes, all of the rats did develop cancer, poor things. The other thing that Seralini did that was, I think, rightly criticized was he didn't keep any data on how much food the rats were eating. And when somebody asked him about it, he said, well, I just let them eat as much as they want. Great scientific design here. We're doing great. And finally, rats don't really eat just corn. These rats were fed 100% corn, and unless a rat got trapped in a corn silo or something, that's not going to happen in nature. They'd much rather have some variety in their diet, some insects, that sort of thing. And then the final point, just to emphasize that it doesn't seem to cause cancer in mammals, is that the US has been using like 80 to 90% GM corn and soybeans and things in their animal feed for the past 15, 20 years, and there's been no increase in the amounts of cancer reported among livestock. So it just doesn't seem to hold up that GMOs cause cancer. This claim, on the other hand, I found a lot more plausible. If you're changing the genetic composition of a food, couldn't that make it less nutritious? On the surface, I think that's a perfectly reasonable concern. But when you look at the empirical data, it just doesn't seem to have done that. And again, this could be the case in the future, but what the US National Academy of Science found is that there is some variation between GM and non-GM crops. They use GE for gene edited, but it's the same thing. But it's no different than the variation you find among regular non-GM crops. And I think the reason for that is that there are a lot of factors that can affect the nutrition content of produce. The soil, the acidity of the soil, the fertilizer, the water, all of these kinds of things can and do affect the nutrient content of the crops. So I think that would be true for GM and non-GM crops because they work basically the same. The other broad category of concern you hear a lot about GMOs is that it's somehow bad for the environment. And I want to first deal with the vagueness of that claim. The environment is not a specific term. The environment is what is around you. Right now, we're in the environment of this room. Usually, though, when people say the environment, although I wish they would delimit a bit more, what they mean is everything on the planet that is not us. This is very broad. So I want to get a little bit more specific about the claims that they're making about how this can affect other plants and animal species and whether they stack up or not, but I would just like to keep in mind for everybody that environment is a very broad category. So the first thing that I saw a lot about arguing against GMOs with the environment is that the GMOs will escape the fields and take over. Probably none of you are familiar with the southeastern United States, except for maybe my colleague John here. This is, I think, a painting, I don't think it's a real image, of kudzu, which is a vine that did take over the southeastern United States. It is rampant, and it is, as this painting depicts, it's choking out trees and native flora. But again, we could have a different GMO in the future, but as far as we are aware, this has never happened with any GM crops ever. You might get a stray one, in the roadside ditch here and there, but it's not going to take over like kudzu's taken over. And I think part of the reason for that is that kudzu is a weed. It is naturally, biologically very aggressive and very good at reproducing. Versus crops, because we've bred them to benefit us, via nutrition, taste, ability to grow, and so on, they need management. And crops, even non-GM crops, if you put them out in the forest, they would very quickly die. Almost certainly. You could probably find a few exceptions, but generally speaking. So I don't think we're in any danger of any current or likely GM crops taking over anything anytime soon. The next concern is that GMOs cause superweeds. And I love this term of this bad thing being called superweeds, because you just picture a plant that's got like a superhero cape on it, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Superweeds are sort of analogous to when you have a super bug, like an antibiotic-resistant bacteria in a hospital, and it's caused by essentially the same thing. In a hospital, if you're prescribing too many antibiotics, the bacteria can become resistant to the antibiotics. In the same way, if you're spraying weeds too often with the same herbicide, you end up with weeds that can resist that herbicide. And it is the case that since the introduction of GM crops, you've had an increase in particularly glyphosate use, because most of these are designed to be used with glyphosate. And that's what you can see in the graph there. It's pretty significant, particularly in the case of cotton. When you have these crops that are resistant to the use of it, they do use the herbicide more. And that has led to a slight increase in the rate of herbicide-resistant weeds. This is a problem that was happening anyway, but it does seem to have accelerated it. The other thing that I want to say, though, is just let's keep this in context, because sometimes glyphosate is being used in place of stronger, more toxic herbicides, because it's more effective when you have this combination of glyphosate and a Roundup-ready crop. So sometimes that's still better, but it does kind of create this externality problem. And the last big claim I want to talk about on the environmental side is that GMOs reduce biodiversity. And many who consider themselves environmentalists consider biodiversity to be really important and inherently valuable. Biodiversity just means having a lot of animal, plant, etc. species, and I don't know that you can argue very soundly in most circumstances that it is valuable in and of itself. There may be particular cases, but I don't think that there is much support for that, and I've studied horticulture and ecology, so I am somewhat familiar with the arguments in that field. But the other thing is, when you look at how GMOs have affected animals and weeds and things like that, we have to break it down again into the insect-resistant and the herbicide-resistant to really see the results. Because with insect-resistant crops, you basically have the pesticide built into the crop. And so the result of that is you no longer need to spray pesticides, or nowhere near as many. So this quote is from a gentleman in Western India who adopted BT cotton, and he had previously described that when they were spraying lots of pesticides, they couldn't hear the birds near their village. There weren't so many insects or frogs or anything. And now, he says, we have again chirping birds near our villages. Our national bird, peacock, has arrived back. Pigeons are there. Insects we can see again. We can see frogs during the rains. So animal kingdom was also returning to normal after the advent of BT. So you can imagine the increase in pleasure that causes for the people in that village of being able to hear the birds again and see these signs of life. On the other hand, when you have the herbicide-resistant crops, what you have is, in that field, what's called a monoculture, which is a big word basically just saying there's just one plant here. But that is what we want in a field, because otherwise the weeds start to choke out the crop. And weeds, as I said before, are biologically very aggressive. if you exclude them from your field, there is absolutely nothing that's going to stop them from growing right over there outside of your field. And that is what weeds do. So even though you do have a monoculture in these specific areas, we're not wiping the species off the face of the planet. Just not happening. So overall, what are the environmental impacts of GMOs? Insecticide use goes down, dangerous herbicide use goes down, carbon emissions go down, soil runoff goes down, which means reduced risk of floods, by the way. Conservation or no tillage, which we'll talk more about later, goes up, but that basically helps protect the soil and is actually cheaper as well. And as a result, soil quality, which is measured in things like how compacted the soil is, how many microorganisms are in the soil, those sorts of things go up. So I'd say that's a pretty positive picture. Another category of argument you hear against GMOs quite a bit is that GMOs in some way hurt small farmers. And before we get any further with that, I would just like to point out that nobody is forcing farmers to use GM seed. There are governments forcing farmers not to use GM seed, but nobody is forcing them to use it. They are choosing to use it when they are. However, the most coherent argument I could find in this vein was that when farmers grow non-GM seed, they grow the crop, they save the seed for the next year, versus when they grow a GMO crop, they're not allowed to do that because the seed is patented. They have to buy it again next year. And that is more expensive. Obviously, the GM seed is generally more expensive anyway, but then if you have to buy it again every year versus saving it, I mean, there's some labor cost in that, but it does end up costing a bit more. But if you look at the profit of farmers since GMO crops have been introduced, there's this lovely review that looked at this data for 1996 to 2020, so it's almost the whole time GMOs have been on the market. And the increase in income for those using GM crops was $261 billion US dollars. But that is not all in the US. 52% of that is for farmers in developing countries who have earned that much more using GM technology. Where is that extra money coming from, you might ask? Mostly it's coming from yield gains, 72%. But 28% is coming from cost savings because you don't have to spend so much dealing with weeds, you don't have to spend so much on pesticides, and so you end up saving money in that, from those things. And so in developing countries, for every extra dollar that they invested in GM crop technology, they earned $5.22 on average. So again, nobody's forcing them to use these technologies, but if I were a small farmer, I know what I'd choose. In the same vein, we have that GMOs are somehow an example of neocolonialism. I have to take the claim seriously because people are seriously promoting it. So even though I find it very strange. Vandana Shiva is one of the people who promotes that. She's a virulent anti-GMO campaigner in India who claims that Western science is a local tradition that has been spread through intellectual colonization. Sorry. I don't know what that is. Feel free to enlighten me. But I would like to point out again that nobody's forcing anybody to use GM crops. So whatever you think about past instances of colonialism, and there obviously have been instances where force has been used and that was wrong. In this case, there is no force being used. Nobody's making anybody do anything. It is true, of course, as I said, that GMOs were developed in the US and Europe, so it is a Western product. But if you're saying that people in India and Africa and the developing world can't use anything from the West, and also this means that we can't benefit from them in any way, we are just dividing off the world and condemning each half of it, or however you want to break it down, I don't really care, each part of the world to only have themselves for innovation and to not benefit from innovations and ideas and progress that's happening elsewhere. Versus when we have a more open system and we can share benefits, we can benefit from those innovations and that progress. So contrary to what Ms. Shiva thinks, this is actually benefiting everybody. I would also just like to point out that in particularly poor countries, there are a number of projects where large biotech companies such as Monsanto have donated the genes necessary. Monsanto's been acquired, but when it was called Monsanto, they were donating the genes necessary and suspending their patent rights voluntarily so that farmers in, for example, Uganda and Bangladesh could in fact save their seed, and trying to keep the cost down so that the seed would cost about the same to still solve their problems, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And finally, Johan alluded to Franken foods, and you get this argument that these Franken foods are not natural, and somehow we're playing God by changing genes in these ways. And to this I say, maybe not. Maybe they're not natural, if you define natural as man-made. But so what? Clean drinking water is not natural. Medicine's not natural. Poison is. There are lots of natural poisons. And so I don't think that dividing line of natural versus unnatural, particularly in the realm of making food, which we've been doing for thousands and thousands of years, is significant. So now the positive side. As I sort of alluded to before, GMOs do have higher yields pretty much across the board in lesser or greater extents. Some examples here: insect-resistant cotton in 11 countries looked at, yields went up between 2 and 30% for an average of 14%. Insect-resistant corn in 12 countries, average yield increases were between 5 and 23% with an average of 17%. I think the reason for this much variation is just that there's all kinds of different things that happen in the real world that can affect crop yields, from weather events to unexpected pests and things like that. But still, we're seeing consistent increases in yields with the use of GMOs. And it's also interesting to note that the gains have mostly been in developing countries again. I think that's partially because these countries were struggling more before with pests and weeds and those sorts of things, that GMOs have sort of allowed them to leverage up and be closer to wealthy countries when it comes to producing food. And a sort of side effect of these higher yields is that we don't need as much land to produce the same amount of food. Dan was talking about having lab-grown meat and not needing a ton of land for agriculture. If we wanted to stop using gene-edited seed, but keep food production at the same level so that people don't starve, right? To keep it at 2020 levels and stop using GMOs, we would need to plant 23.4 million more hectares of agricultural land. To put that into context, that's the whole agricultural area of the Philippines and Vietnam, or 7.6 times the size of Belgium. So whatever you think the land should be used for, whether it's concreting over and put housing on it, or nature reserves or whatever, we can't have it if we don't use GMOs. Or some other innovative solution that I don't know about yet. The other thing I've again alluded to is that insect-resistant GMOs reduce the use of pesticides. So we have two examples here. On the graph, you can see the green line is the use of Bt corn in the US, and the blue line is the use of pesticides on that corn. The trend is very, very clear. As we have more Bt corn, we have way less, down to, in many cases, zero insecticide use. Similarly, in India, between 2002 and 2008, Indian farmers who used Bt cotton, their average pesticide use went down 50%. In many individual cases, it went down to zero. And the result of that is that Bt cotton around the world helps avoid an estimated 2.4 million cases of pesticide poisoning. And this is mostly for the agricultural workers, by the way, because usually if you clean your produce, you're not really ingesting enough to be poisoned by it, but the people who are there spraying the fields are ingesting a lot more. So the other thing I said I'd come back to is tillage. So herbicide-resistant GMOs typically reduce tillage. And tilling is when basically just breaking up the soil so that you can put the weeds back under and you have loose soil for the crops to grow in. But that is done most of the time these days by giant machines that can do the whole field relatively quickly. The problem with these giant machines is that although it does help manage the weeds, it pushes the soil underneath together and compacts it so that the plants can't grow, actually. This also results in more soil erosion. It tends to kill off there are tons, like millions and millions of tiny organisms in the soil, and tilling is not very good for them because you're just squishing them. Versus when you have herbicide-resistant crops, you don't have to till as much because you have another method of dealing with the crops, and so you can either go no-till or you can till less. And the result of that has been that in 2020 alone, carbon dioxide emissions from tilling were reduced by 23.6 billion kilograms, which is the equivalent of 15.6 million cars, what they produce per year. So fairly significant, and it is also easier for the farmers. We talked a little bit about disease-resistant GMOs, and I've got a few examples, two examples, I guess, for you here. So Tanzania is one of the developing countries I've been sort of talking about. In Tanzania, cassava is a staple crop, and when we say something is a staple crop, what that means is that it can comprise 72 to 80% of the diet of people in that country. But cassava was dealing with a virus a few years ago. And so GM scientists got together and they said, let's make cassava that's resistant to this virus. And they did it fairly quickly. And it's gone through testing. I'm not sure if it's been approved for commercialization yet, but success story there. This is more recent work, what we have in the photos here. I don't recall who did it, sorry. I think it's scientists in the US. But they said, we've got this blight problem with potatoes. Let's make resistant potatoes using GM, and you can see the results in this white box here. We have the regular non-GM potatoes, which almost all died, and then we have the flourishing potatoes here, which were the GM resistant crops. So it's literally like night and day, the difference. Another thing that I actually didn't know much about before I started preparing for this talk is micronutrient deficiencies. They are very widespread. Even in the developing world, a lot of us have micronutrient deficiencies that keep us from being at optimal health. But in the developing world, they can be so severe that they cause much more serious problems. One of the big ones is vitamin A, which I had no idea before I started doing this, kills between 1 and 3 million people a year, and that's mostly children under the age of 5. Even if it doesn't kill them, it can cause blindness, it can cause serious immune problems. I think sometimes the immune problems lead to the death eventually, but so this is a very serious problem. So one solution that people working with GM have come up with is golden rice, because golden rice in a lot of these countries, or rice in a lot of these countries, is that staple crop, what makes up a lot of their diet. So they've managed to create rice. It's called golden rice because it is a golden yellow color. It doesn't change the taste at all. Doesn't change how it is to grow for farmers, but it has, depending on the variety, quite a bit of vitamin A in it. And so a child, depending on the variety, could get their vitamin A in as little as 40 grams of rice a day. An adult needs about twice as much. But this is not very much. This is 1 bowl of rice. Similar project is going on with bananas, particularly in Africa. They're again calling them golden bananas. I don't think bananas are already yellow, so I'm not really sure why they're calling them golden bananas, but anyway. We're addressing various micronutrient deficiencies through GM. Another concern that people have is the changing climate. It's getting a lot hotter in certain areas of the world. And so some scientists, this work was done at Baylor College in Texas, and they have decided to deal with this problem by creating GM, they found the gene to make plants more heat resistant, and they tested it in tomatoes. And so you can see here we've got these dead regular tomatoes when they're exposed to Texas heat, and then you have the GM tomatoes, which are much healthier and much happier. So you might say then, but Angel, we could do all of this with traditional breeding. And it is true that traditional breeding can affect the nutrient content and it can produce heat-resistant crops, but it's way, way slower. So there are some different breeding techniques you see on the screen. Your traditional crossbreeding where you just change the pollen from one plant to another, which is probably one of the oldest techniques, takes about 9 to 10 years to get a usable variety out of that. Mutations, some people figured out that, sometimes plants mutate and that can be really useful for us. What if we made them mutate? Would that be useful? And kind of. There are a few problems with it. Firstly, to make them mutate, you usually have to use dangerous chemicals or radiation, so there's a cancer risk there. And it also mutations are often not good. And so it takes typically 6 to 7 years to get something usable out of that. Transgene breeding I'm not as familiar with, but you are messing with the different genes in a very non-specific way. And so again, you can get things that are useful out of that, but it takes 4 to 6 years. Versus using CRISPR technology, 2 to 3 years to get a usable crop. So it's a fifth of the time. It's saving lots of time, it's saving lots of money, and we're able to deal with problems like diseases way more quickly. So I said I'd come back to some of the other uses of gene editing technology. Medical research is a huge one because we can look at the different effects of various genes and help pin down where the genome is. We can try to address genetic diseases directly. That's been done with animals and people to some extent. Small trials right now. Most countries have a lot of restrictions on what you can do to people. And also producing medicine. So it used to be that you had to use pigs to produce insulin, and that was obviously very expensive and time-consuming. And in 1982, Paul Berg and his colleagues used bacteria to produce insulin for the first time, and that made it a lot cheaper and easier. The controversial thing is what Tom briefly alluded to in the panel, is that what if you could change your baby's characteristics, like its hair color or its eye color, or even something more significant? And that is, I would like to say, is illegal in every country I checked, and is ethically very controversial, but it is a thing that we could talk about as to whether or not it's a good idea. So to conclude, GMOs are awesome. They're the way that we are able to feed the growing population and to feed them in a way that helps deal with a lot of the problems that they have locally, whether those are micronutrient deficiencies or problems with the climate or diseases and so on. And I can't wait to see where else they go. So thank you very much.